Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody wants to hear about what happened in Garrison County anymore, but someone needs to know the truth before everyone involved either dies or convinces themselves it never happened. 26 years have passed, and most folks have moved on, pretended to forget, or just plain refused to talk about that September afternoon when our whole world cracked open like a rotten egg. I was driving the backup bus that day, following behind Marlene's route through those deep pine woods that stretch between Shepherd Mills and the county line, where the trees grow so thick you can barely see sky even at noon. We'd been friends since our kids started kindergarten together, and she'd been driving bus 47 for 12 years without so much as a fender scrape. That morning she'd complained about a headache, said the barometric pressure was making her teeth hurt, and I'd offered to take her route, but she just laughed and said she'd driven through worse. When that storm rolled in around 2:30, it came fast and mean, like something angry had been building up pressure all day and finally decided to let loose. The radio started crackling with weather warnings, telling us to find immediate shelter, and I pulled into the parking lot of an old gas station to wait it out while the rain hammered my windshield so hard I thought it might crack. I tried reaching Marlene on the radio, and at first all I got was static, that thick electric sound that makes your fillings ache, but then her voice came through clear as day. She sounded calm, almost cheerful, saying she'd found an old church about a mile off Highway 94 where they could wait out the storm. Said the kids were fine, maybe a little scared but singing songs to pass the time. I knew that stretch of road like my own reflection, had driven it hundreds of times, and there wasn't any church there. Hadn't been anything there except pine trees and deer trails since before my grandfather's time. I tried telling her she must be confused about the location, maybe meant the Methodist church over on Farm Road 223, but she insisted she knew exactly where she was, even described the place in detail. White clapboard siding with forest green shutters, she said, a bell tower with a copper weather vane shaped like a rooster, and the sweetest elderly couple who'd opened the doors for them when the lightning started getting close. She said they were passing out sugar cookies and apple juice to the kids, had towels ready for them to dry off, and the woman was showing the girls how to make paper dolls from old hymnals while the boys played checkers with the husband. The way she described it sounded so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that for a moment I doubted my own memory of that empty stretch of road. By the time the storm passed, maybe 45 minutes later, the afternoon sun came out like nothing had happened, steam rising off the asphalt in ghostly wisps that made everything look like a dream. I drove straight to Highway 94, searching for any turnoff that might lead to a church, checking every dirt road and logging trail between mile marker 31 and the bridge over Cypress Creek. There was nothing there but the same dense forest there'd always been, the pine needles still dripping from the rain, and not a single tire track in the mud except my own. I radioed dispatch, told them we might have a situation, that Marlene wasn't where she said she'd be, and within 20 minutes we had 3 sheriff's deputies and half the volunteer fire department combing those back roads. We searched until the sun started sinking behind the trees, painting everything the color of rust, and that's when Deputy Holland's voice came over the radio, shaky and strange, saying they'd found the bus. It was parked on an old logging road 15 miles from where Marlene said they'd stopped, so deep in the woods that the search helicopter almost missed it even with all the lights on. The bus was just sitting there, engine off, emergency door hanging open like a broken jaw, perfectly aligned between 2 rows of loblolly pines, as if someone had carefully threaded it through the trees. Holland said Marlene was in the driver's seat, eyes wide open but not seeing anything, not responding to anyone, her hands still gripping the wheel so tight they had to pry her fingers loose one by one. The kids who were still on the bus, 8 of them, were sitting in their assigned seats like nothing was wrong, humming the same tune in perfect unison, some old hymn nobody could quite place. They stopped the moment the deputies stepped aboard, turned their heads in sync like they were all connected by the same string, and smiled these identical little smiles that Holland said made his chest feel too tight. The thing that made everyone stop talking, stop breathing almost, was when they did the head count and came up 3 short. Kevin Hartley, age 7, blonde kid with a gap between his front teeth who loved dinosaurs and always sat in seat number 4. Melissa Crawford, 9 years old, wore thick glasses and carried a purple backpack covered in butterfly stickers. And Anthony Vega, 8, the kid who'd won the district spelling bee just the week before and never went anywhere without his lucky baseball cap. Their seats were empty, but the other kids acted like they were still there, leaving spaces for them when they lined up, talking to the empty air beside them like they were having conversations. When Sheriff Morrison asked where their classmates went, all 8 kids said the exact same thing at the exact same time, word for word, like they'd rehearsed it. They stayed with the nice people because they weren't done with their cookies yet. They brought in child psychologists from Houston, experts in trauma and mass hysteria, people with degrees from schools I'd never heard of who used words like shared delusion and collective false memory syndrome. But none of them could explain how 8 kids from different families, different backgrounds, could tell the exact same story down to the smallest detail. They all described the same elderly couple. The woman wore a yellow dress with tiny blue flowers and smelled like vanilla extract, had silver hair pinned up with pearl bobby pins, and a gold locket that she kept touching. The man had calloused hands but gentle eyes, wore suspenders over a checkered shirt, and walked with a slight limp that favored his right side. They all remembered the same songs playing from an old radio in the corner, the same taste of cinnamon in the cookies, the same orange tabby cat that rubbed against their legs, and they all drew the same picture when asked about the church interior, right down to the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bird in flight. What the kids couldn't tell anyone, or wouldn't tell anyone, was how they'd gotten from Highway 94 to that logging road, or what happened during the 2 hours nobody could account for between Marlene's last radio call and when they found the bus. Their parents wanted answers, demanded them, some getting angry and others just crying in the sheriff's office. But the kids just kept humming that hymn and talking about how nice the cookies were, how the lady had promised they could come back anytime they wanted. The FBI got involved when Kevin's backpack turned up at a rest stop in Arkansas 3 days later, completely dry despite the rain, with all his school supplies still inside, but arranged differently than his mother had packed them, his dinosaur pencils lined up by size, and his lunch money folded into perfect tiny squares. Melissa's purple backpack appeared a week later in a thrift store donation bin in Oklahoma, turned in by an employee who noticed it still had her name written on the tag in her mother's handwriting. Inside, they found her homework, completed but in handwriting that looked like hers, yet somehow different, neater, more controlled, with answers to math problems they hadn't covered yet in class. Anthony's bag was the last to surface, discovered by hikers in a Louisiana state park, hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, with no explanation for how it got there. His spelling bee trophy was inside, polished to a shine it had never had before, along with a note in his careful printing that just said, "Thank you for the cookies," over and over again, filling 3 pages front and back. Marlene never spoke again, not one word, though the doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords or her brain. She'd sit in her room at the county psychiatric facility, moving her lips like she was having conversations with someone, gesturing with her hands and sometimes laughing at jokes nobody else could hear. Her husband brought her home after 6 months, said he'd rather have her there even if she couldn't talk, and she lived another 4 years before her heart gave out one night, peaceful in her sleep. The night she died, her husband said she'd been more animated than usual, kept pointing at the corner of the room and smiling, mouthing words he couldn't understand. And just before midnight, she spoke her first and last words since that September day, clear as spring water. "They're here for me now." The 8 kids who came back seemed fine at first, went back to school, played with their friends, did their homework, but their parents noticed things that made them call each other late at night, whispering their fears like sharing them might make them less real. All 8 kids would stop what they were doing at the exact same time each day, 2:47 in the afternoon, and stare off into space for exactly 3 minutes, lips moving silently. They'd wake up at night and stand at their windows, waving at something in the darkness, and when asked who they were waving at, they'd just say, "the nice people," and go back to bed. One by one, the families moved away from Garrison County over the next few years, scattered across the country like seeds on the wind, trying to escape whatever had touched their children that day. But I kept in touch with some of them, and they all told me the same thing. No matter where they moved, their kids still stopped at 2:47, still waved at empty darkness, still hummed that hymn nobody could identify. Kevin, Melissa, and Anthony were never found, though people claimed to see them over the years in different places, always the same age as when they disappeared, always walking hand in hand with an elderly couple who matched the description the other kids had given. A truck driver swore he saw them at a rest stop in Nevada, said the kids looked happy and well-fed, but something about their eyes wasn't right, like they were looking through him instead of at him. A waitress in Montana called the hotline after serving breakfast to a group that fit their description, said the children were polite, but never spoke, just pointed at what they wanted on the menu, and the elderly couple paid with bills from 1957 that looked brand new. The sighting stopped after a few years, but every September when that first cool front pushes through and the storms start building, I drive out to that stretch of Highway 94 and park where Marlene said she'd found the church, and I wait, and I watch, and I listen. Because sometimes, just sometimes, when the thunder rolls just right through those pines, I swear I can hear children singing. February in West Texas feels like the edge of the world, especially when you're standing on 60 acres of scrubland watching tumbleweeds roll past your dead uncle's ranch house. I just turned 34 that winter, burned out from a decade of coding in Austin, watching my marriage fall apart over 70-hour work weeks and promises I never kept. When Uncle Frank's lawyer called about the inheritance, it felt like the universe throwing me a lifeline. A remote ranch outside Marfa where I could code in peace, no traffic, no office politics, just wide open spaces and the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Frank had lived out there alone for 20 years after retiring from the oil business, and though we weren't close, he'd always sent birthday cards with crisp $100 bills inside, signed in his shaky handwriting. Wallace showed up my second day there, driving a rust-covered Ford that looked older than me, wearing overalls that had seen better decades. He lived on the next property over, he said, about 5 miles down the dirt road that connected our ranches to the main highway. Tall and lean with sun-damaged skin and pale blue eyes, he had this way of standing too still when he talked, like a scarecrow that had learned to speak. He helped me figure out the well pump that first week, showed me how to work the generator when the power went out, even brought over a casserole his wife had made, though I never saw any wife. Said he'd been friends with Frank for 15 years, checked on him regular-like, especially toward the end when Frank's health started failing. I was grateful for the help, honestly, trying to juggle my remote software job while learning how to manage a property that seemed determined to fall apart. About 3 weeks in, I was cleaning out the barn when I found them. 4 trail cameras, the expensive kind hunters use, tucked behind old paint cans and rusty tools on a shelf. The batteries were dead, but the memory cards were still inside. I figured Frank had used them to watch for coyotes, or maybe catch whoever had been stealing gas from the tank near the road. I brought them inside that evening, popped the SD cards into my laptop while waiting for code to compile. The first camera had normal stuff, deer wandering through, a family of javelinas, the occasional roadrunner. But the second camera made me set down my coffee mug and lean closer to the screen. The timestamp showed 3 years ago. The camera positioned inside the house pointed at a hallway. There was Wallace, clear as day, walking down Frank's hallway at 2 in the morning, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. My first thought was maybe Frank had given him a key for emergencies. Made sense for an elderly man living alone. But then I clicked through more footage. Wallace appeared week after week, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always moving through the house with that same casual familiarity. In one video from 2 years ago, he stood in Frank's bedroom doorway for 17 minutes, just standing there in the dark, watching my uncle sleep. The camera's night vision made his eyes glow white like a possum's. I found myself holding my breath, watching this man stand perfectly still while my uncle's chest rose and fell under the blankets. Then Wallace would turn and walk out, disappearing until the next week's visit. The pattern went on for months, maybe years. I couldn't tell how long without checking every file. I spent the next morning going through Frank's papers, looking for anything that might explain this. Found his death certificate in a manila folder, listed natural causes, heart failure in his sleep last November. But in the same box, I found receipts from a veterinary clinic in Alpine. Frank had 3 dogs over the past 2 years, according to the records. Buster, a German shepherd who died of poisoning in January of last year. Then Duke, a lab mix, poisoned in May. Finally Ranger, another shepherd, poisoned just 6 weeks before Frank died. Each vet report used the same words: antifreeze poisoning, likely accidental ingestion. But 3 dogs in less than 2 years? And every time, Wallace had been the one to find them, according to the notes, always calling Frank to break the news, always offering to help bury them out by the mesquite grove. The last dog died right around the time Frank's health took a sharp downturn, according to dates on his medical papers. That afternoon, I changed every lock on the property. Spent $300 at the hardware store in town. Came back with new deadbolts, chain locks, even steel bars for the sliding doors. Wallace pulled up while I was installing the 3rd deadbolt on the back door, got out of his truck with that same measured walk. Asked what I was doing. Said Frank never locked anything. Said it was the beauty of living out here, the trust between neighbors. I told him I was from the city, old habits, you understand. He stood there for a long moment, those pale eyes moving from the new lock to my face and back again. Then he smiled, showing teeth the color of old ivory, and said he understood completely. City folk need time to adjust. Before he left, he mentioned he still had some of Frank's tools in his shed. Said he'd bring them by tomorrow. I told him I'd come get them myself when I had time. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal. The new locks held, but I could hear someone trying each door, methodically, patiently. Front door, then kitchen, then the sliding door on the porch. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but out here the only spot that got any signal was a patch near the garden fence and barely one bar even there. The nearest sheriff's office was 45 minutes away in good conditions, probably an hour at night. I sat in the dark living room with Frank's old shotgun across my lap, listening to footsteps circle the house until dawn. When the sun came up, I found fresh boot prints in the dirt under every window, and the new lock on the barn had scratches around the keyhole. Someone had tried to pick it but gave up. The barn had always given me an odd feeling anyway, something about the way it sat too low on its foundation, like it was hiding something underneath. I decided to search the barn properly that morning. Every corner, every old feed bin and storage area. Behind a false wall made of rotting plywood, I found a trap door with a padlock that my new keys didn't fit. Used a crowbar to break it open, and the smell that came up made me gag. Mothballs and mildew and something else, something organic and wrong. The ladder down was sturdy, newer than anything else in the barn. At the bottom was a storm cellar I never knew existed. Concrete walls lined with plastic sheeting. There was a camping cot with blankets that looked recently washed, canned goods with dates from this year, jugs of water, a chemical toilet. Someone had been living down here and recently. On a card table in the corner sat 3 photo albums and a stack of spiral notebooks. My stomach turned to ice when I opened the first album. Every page was filled with pictures of Frank, hundreds of them taken from outside windows, through doorways, from behind trees. Frank eating breakfast, Frank watching TV, Frank sleeping in his chair on the porch. The notebooks were worse, page after page of Wallace's cramped handwriting, dating back years. detailed logs of Frank's daily routines, what time he woke up, what he ate, when he went to town, who he talked to on the phone. Then the tone shifted about 2 years ago. Wallace started writing about how Frank had promised him the ranch, how they'd made a deal years before, how Frank was going to leave it all to him since he had no family who cared. Except that was a lie, because I existed, and Frank knew it. The entries got darker, more frantic. Wallace wrote about the dogs being obstacles, about how they barked too much, alerted Frank to his nighttime visits. He described mixing antifreeze into meat scraps, leaving them where only the dogs would find them. The final entries, from just before Frank died, were the worst. Wallace wrote about patience, about waiting, about how old men die in their sleep all the time, especially when they're already sick, especially when they take heart medication that can be so dangerous if the dose is wrong. I grabbed the notebooks and albums, my legs shaking as I climbed back up the ladder. Needed to get to town, to the sheriff, show them everything. But when I emerged from the barn, Wallace's truck was parked behind my car, blocking me in. He was leaning against the driver's side door, arms crossed, that scarecrow stillness back in his posture. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me standing there with his journals clutched in my arms. Then he sighed, long and disappointed, like I was a student who'd failed an easy test. Said he'd hoped I'd be smarter than Frank. Said Frank never should have put those cameras up, never should have gotten suspicious. His hand moved to his pocket, and I saw the outline of something heavy there. He told me we needed to talk about the future of the ranch, about what Frank really wanted, about how things were going to be. I ran, dropped everything and sprinted toward the house, hearing his boots pounding the dirt behind me. Made it inside, slammed the door, threw the deadbolt just as his body hit the wood. While he pounded on the door, I grabbed my laptop, my car keys, and Frank's shotgun, then climbed out the bedroom window on the opposite side of the house, circled around through the mesquite trees, staying low, thorns tearing at my clothes. Wallace was still at the front door when I reached his truck. The keys were in the ignition, just like you'd expect from someone who thought they owned the place already. I threw my stuff in and started it up. Saw him running toward me in the rearview mirror as I floored it down the dirt road. Drove straight to the sheriff's office in Presidio, handed over everything, the camera footage on my laptop, photos of the cellar I'd taken with my phone. They arrested Wallace that afternoon at his property, found more evidence in his actual house, including Frank's missing will that left everything to me, not him. Wallace got 25 to life for murder, though they could only definitively prove what he'd done to Frank, not what he might have been planning for me. I sold the ranch 6 months later to a young couple from Houston who wanted to raise goats. Never told them about the cellar under the barn, figured they'd either find it or they wouldn't. Sometimes I dream about those 17 minutes of footage, Wallace standing in Frank's doorway, perfectly still in that green night vision glow, just watching and waiting. I work from my apartment in Dallas now, triple-check my locks every night, and always keep my phone charged. People ask me sometimes why I didn't stay on the ranch, why I gave up all that space and freedom. I tell them the truth, or at least part of it. Some inheritances come with more than you bargained for, and some neighbors are a lot closer than 5 miles away. My boots left perfect impressions in the cracked mud where Lake Buchanan used to be. 60 acres of dried lake bed that hadn't seen water in 2 years. Environmental consulting meant I got paid good money to measure how fast Texas drought was destroying everything, taking soil samples and calculating erosion rates, while the sun cooked me alive through my long-sleeve field shirt. 4 days into mapping the Western Basin, I'd already filled 3 notebooks with measurements, and my truck had a 1/4 inch of dust on the dashboard despite keeping the windows up. The reservoir used to be deep enough for weekend boaters and drunk college kids on spring break, but now it was just me, my equipment, and miles of exposed earth that looked like the surface of Mars. I'd been photographing these strange circular patterns where whirlpools must have formed during the last drainage, when my boot caught on something hard beneath the silt, At first glance, it looked like trash, or maybe old camping gear from when this was still waterfront property, but trash doesn't have a ribcage. The western shirt had faded to the color of weak tea, pearl snap buttons still catching the afternoon light, and the bones underneath were the yellowish brown of old ivory. A wallet chain ran from the belt loops, disappearing into what remained of denim jeans, and the skull rested sideways with its jaw unhinged like it was screaming at the ground. Finding dead cattle happens all the time out here, and I once stumbled across a coyote that had been dead so long it was basically mummified. But human remains hit your nervous system differently. Your brain starts calculating how long this person's been missing, who might have been waiting for them to come home, whether they died before or after the water disappeared. I backed away slowly, pulled out my satellite phone with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling, and made the call to county dispatch while standing upwind from what I'd found. The sheriff arrived 40 minutes later with 2 deputies and a crime scene photographer who looked ready to pass out from the heat before he even got his camera out. Sheriff Colton was one of those Texas lawmen who'd probably been wearing the same size uniform for 30 years. Belly hanging over his belt, sweat stains permanent fixtures under his arms. He took one look at the body and started making calls to Austin for a forensics team, muttering about how this was going to be a jurisdictional nightmare since the reservoir crossed 3 county lines. While we waited, I showed them my field notes, explaining I'd been contracted by the state to document erosion patterns, that I had permits to be out here, that the landowner knew I was working the area. Colton kept nodding, but his eyes were scanning the lake bed, and I saw his expression change when he spotted something about 30 yards from where we stood. "Stay here," he told me, but of course I followed anyway, keeping my distance while he and the deputies approached what turned out to be another body, this one partially buried under a collapsed section of bank. Then they found another one 50 feet away, wearing what looked like a disco-era polyester dress. By the time the forensics team arrived from Austin, we'd flagged 17 different sites, bodies scattered across a quarter-mile of exposed lakebed, like someone had been using the reservoir as their personal cemetery for decades. The forensics team leader, a woman named Diane who wore her hair in a tight bun despite the heat, told me they'd need my documentation of the area, my photographs showing the water levels from old surveys, anything that might help determine how long these people had been down here. She had this controlled way of talking that reminded me of how doctors deliver bad news, professional but human enough to keep you from completely falling apart. What made everything worse was the cards. Each body had one, sealed in plastic like a driver's license, tucked into a pocket or what remained of a purse. They all had different Bible verses printed on them in this old-fashioned typewriter font, verses about judgment and punishment, and casting out the wicked. Diane showed me one that read, "For the wages of sin is death," in faded red ink, the lamination yellow with age but still protecting the card after what must have been decades underwater. The oldest body they could roughly date by the clothing looked to be from the early 60s, a woman in a shift dress and pillbox hat like she'd walked straight out of a Kennedy-era magazine. The newest one, though, that's what made everyone stop talking for a minute, because the newest one was wearing clothes you could still buy at Target, modern athletic wear with the tags intact, the kind of moisture-wicking fabric that hadn't even existed until a few years ago. Sheriff Colton pulled me aside while the forensics team worked, asked if I knew who owned the land around the reservoir. I told him it was mostly Gary Whitman's ranch, thousands of acres his family had owned since before the reservoir was even built. The Whitmans were old Texas money, cattle and oil, the kind of family that had a law firm on retainer and donated enough to local campaigns that nobody asked too many questions about their business. Colton's jaw tightened when I mentioned Gary's name, and he asked if I'd had any contact with him since I'd been working out here. Just once, I told him, when Gary had stopped by my work site 2 days earlier in his pristine white truck, asked how long I'd be surveying, made small talk about the drought and beef prices. He'd been friendly enough, even offered me water from his cooler, but he'd also taken pictures of my license plate with his phone, said it was for his insurance records in case anything happened on his property. They kept me there until almost midnight, taking my statement 3 different times while portable lights turned the lake bed into something from a horror movie. I watched them bag evidence and mark locations, listened to Diane directing her team with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many crime scenes to be shocked anymore. When they finally let me leave, Colton walked me to my truck and suggested I might want to finish my survey work somewhere else, maybe take on a different contract for a while. But I had 2 more weeks of work scheduled, data the state needed for their drought management plans, and I wasn't going to let some old murders chase me away from a job I was being paid to complete. Besides, whoever had done this was probably long dead themselves, considering how old some of those bodies were. That's what I kept telling myself on the drive back to my motel in Brownwood, AC blasting to combat the way fear makes you sweat even when you're cold. The next morning I drove out to the Whitman Ranch instead of the reservoir, figuring I should at least let Gary know what had been found on the edges of his property. The main house sat about 3 miles back from the highway, one of those sprawling limestone structures with a metal roof and wraparound porches that probably cost more than most people make in a lifetime. Gary's truck was parked out front, but it was his mother who answered the door, a woman in her 70s with hair dyed the color of wheat and fingernails painted the exact shade of blood. She said Gary was out checking cattle but invited me in for iced tea. Insisted, actually, with that southern politeness that doesn't really give you a choice. The living room was all leather and dead animals, mounted deer heads and a full-body black bear that had probably never lived within 500 miles of Texas. And she sat me down across from a wall of family photos dating back to when photography was done on tin. Mrs. Whitman talked about the drought while she poured tea from a crystal pitcher, how it was killing their stock tanks and forcing them to truck in water for the cattle. She asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested in soil composition and erosion rates, but her eyes kept drifting to the window like she was waiting for something. Then she mentioned she'd heard about the bodies at the reservoir. News travels fast in small counties, and wasn't it just awful what people would do to each other? The way she said it, casual like discussing weather, made the hair on my neck stand up. She walked over to an old secretary desk and pulled out a photo album, started showing me pictures of the ranch from before the reservoir was built, when her father-in-law ran things. There was a small chapel in several photos, built from the same limestone as the house, with a cross on top that looked handmade from railroad spikes. "That old chapel is still standing," she said, turning pages with those blood-red nails, though nobody uses it anymore since my father-in-law passed 5 years back. He was a man of profound faith, held services there every Sunday for the ranch hands and anyone else who needed salvation. She showed me a photo of him, a giant of a man with hands like shovels and eyes that seemed to follow you even from a 60-year-old photograph. He had very specific ideas about sin and redemption, especially concerning women who'd lost their way. Traveling women, you understand, the kind who drift through towns without family or purpose. He considered it his ministry to offer them guidance. The way she emphasized certain words made my throat tight, and I found myself calculating how many steps it would take to reach the front door. I made an excuse about needing to get back to work, but she insisted on showing me one more thing, walking me through the kitchen to a back room that served as an office. The walls were covered with framed documents, land deeds, and cattle certificates, but what she wanted me to see was on the desk, a stack of old journals bound in cracked leather. My father-in-law kept meticulous records of everything, she said, running her fingers along the spines. Every soul he tried to save, every sermon he preached, every judgment he felt called to make. Gary thinks we should burn them, says they're morbid, but I believe in preserving family history, even the parts that make us uncomfortable. She opened one of the journals to a page covered in tight handwriting, lists of women's names with dates beside them and Bible verses written in red ink. Some of the dates matched up with missing person reports I'd heard Diane mention the night before, women who'd vanished between towns and were never found. Before I could process what I was seeing, Gary walked in through the back door, boots heavy on the hardwood, his presence filling the room like smoke from a chemical fire. He looked at his mother, then at me, then at the open journal on the desk, and his face went through several expressions before settling on something that might have been a smile if smiles could be threats. "Mother's been showing you the family archives," he said, voice flat as roadkill. "She gets sentimental about the old man, even though he's been gone 5 years now. Signed a lot of papers before he died, though, closing out old cases and making sure everything was legal and proper. The sheriff knows all about it, has copies of everything. He moved between me and the door, not obviously blocking it, but making it clear I'd have to go through him to leave. Funny thing about those bodies you found, they all had their identification on them. Made it real easy for the authorities to close their missing person cases. My father was always thorough like that, liked to make sure families had closure even if they never knew it." I told them I had equipment to collect from my work site, back toward the kitchen door while keeping my eyes on Gary. His mother watched with an expression like she was watching a play she'd seen before, knowing how it would end. Gary let me leave but followed me out to my truck, stood there while I fumbled with my keys, and said real quiet that he'd appreciate it if I could finish my survey work quickly, maybe find what I needed from aerial photographs instead of spending so much time on the ground. The threat was clear as broken glass, and I nodded like we just discussed the weather. But when I got back to the reservoir that afternoon to collect my gear, I found something that changed everything. A fresh laminated card tucked under my windshield wiper with my full name typed on it, and a verse from Proverbs about the strange woman whose house is the way to hell. The laminating was still warm from the machine, and when I looked around, I could see fresh tire tracks from Gary's white truck leading back toward the ranch. I drove straight to Austin that afternoon. Didn't even stop at my motel to pack. Just got on the highway with that card on the passenger seat, like evidence of my own future murder. Called my company from the road. Told them I was sick, food poisoning. Needed someone else to finish the reservoir survey. They weren't happy but agreed to send another consultant, some guy named Roger who'd probably never find anything wrong because he wouldn't be looking for it. I stayed with my sister in Houston for 3 weeks, checking news sites every day for updates about the reservoir bodies. But the stories just stopped coming after the initial reports. Sheriff Colton retired suddenly, something about a heart condition, and the new sheriff announced the cases were being classified as cold cases pending further evidence. The FBI never got involved despite bodies crossing state lines, and Diane from the forensics team transferred to a position in Maine 2 months later. Gary Whitman still runs his ranch, still drives that white truck, and according to Google Earth, that limestone chapel is still standing on his property, surrounded by fresh tire tracks that show up in every satellite image no matter when they're taken. I never went back to environmental consulting, got a desk job with the state reviewing other people's field reports, and I still check missing person databases sometimes, looking for women who disappeared near small Texas towns, wondering if the drought will reveal more of them when the next reservoir runs dry. Everyone in Redwater knew better than to cross Mayor Brennan, but I never thought keeping quiet was the same as being complicit, until people started disappearing. I ran the only hardware store in town, been there since my dad passed it down to me 15 years ago, right around when my son Brett was born, and I figured a small town in West Texas would be the perfect place to raise a family. Population barely pushed 800 on a good day, the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did, where the Friday night football game was the social event of the week, and where the mayor had been running unopposed since before I graduated high school. Mayor Brennan wasn't just influential, he was Redwater, had his fingers in everything from the water board to the school district, and folks either loved him or learned to keep their opinions to themselves. It started with old Bill Hawkins back in March, though nobody connected the dots at first. Bill had gotten up at the monthly town meeting, red-faced and shaking his finger, demanding to know why his property taxes had doubled when half the streetlights on his block didn't even work. Mayor Brennan had given him that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, and promised to look into it personally. 2 weeks later, Bill's truck was found abandoned on Route 67, keys still in the ignition, wallet on the dashboard, and Bill was just gone. Sheriff Coleman called it a medical episode, Said Bill probably wandered into the desert confused, maybe early dementia, even though Bill was sharp as a tack and could still beat anyone at chess down at Murphy's Diner. Then there was Maria Gonzalez in April, the woman who ran the bakery on Main Street, and made the mistake of questioning why the mayor's construction company got the contract for the new school renovation without any competitive bidding. She was passionate about it too, brought spreadsheets and everything, showed how the town could save almost $200,000 going with an outfit from Midland. Mayor Brennan had thanked her for her diligence, said the council would review her findings carefully, and even complimented her on the cookies she'd brought to the meeting. 3 weeks after that meeting, Maria's sister came in my store crying, said Maria had left a note about needing to take care of a sick relative in Mexico, except Maria didn't have any relatives in Mexico. Her whole family had been in Texas for 4 generations. By June, when Carl Hendricks stood up to complain about the suspicious rezoning of farmland that just happened to border the mayor's ranch, I started paying attention to the pattern. Carl was a big man, worked oil rigs half his life before settling down to farm, not the type to just up and leave. But 17 days after that meeting, his wife came into my store, eyes hollow and voice flat, told me Carl had taken a job opportunity up north, said he'd send for her and the kids once he got settled. She bought rope and duct tape that day, paid cash, didn't look me in the eye once, and when I asked if everything was all right, she just nodded real slow and walked out like she was in a trance. I decided to install security cameras in July, told my wife Nancy it was for insurance purposes after that break-in over in Coleman County. Really, I wanted to see who was coming and going. Wanted to document things, maybe catch something that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The cameras went up easy enough, 8 of them total, covering every angle of the store inside and out. Plus, I put 2 extra ones at home, one facing the driveway and another watching the front door. The system recorded everything to a hard drive in my office, and I could check the feeds from my phone, which seemed like overkill for a hardware store in a town where most folks didn't even lock their doors. But something in my gut told me to be thorough. For weeks, the cameras showed nothing unusual, just the regular flow of customers, delivery trucks on Thursdays, and the occasional cat crossing the parking lot at night. But then in early August, Tom Ashford made the mistake of questioning the mayor's new water restrictions at the town meeting, specifically why the golf course was exempt when local ranchers were being fined for watering their cattle. Tom was young, maybe 30, had just taken over his dad's ranch and hadn't learned the unspoken rules yet. Mayor Brennan's response was different this time. No smile, just a long stare and a comment about how difficult ranching could be for inexperienced hands, how accidents happened all the time, equipment failed, cattle got sick, banks called in loans. I started checking my cameras obsessively after that meeting, especially at night, and on the 19th day after Tom's confrontation, at exactly 3:47 a.m., I saw them. 3 unmarked white vans, no plates, no company logos, just white metal and tinted windows creeping down Oak Street where Tom lived. I sat there in my boxers staring at my phone screen, watching these vans stop in front of Tom's house. 4 men got out of each van, 12 total, all wearing identical black clothes, moving with military precision. They didn't break down the door, didn't smash windows, they just stood there for a moment, and then Tom's front door opened like they had a key, like someone had let them in, and they walked inside calm as could be. 23 minutes later they came back out, Tom walking between them with this blank expression, not fighting, not struggling, just walking like he was sleepwalking. His wife followed behind, carrying their baby, same empty look on her face, and they all got into the middle van. The other men carried boxes, computers, photo albums, anything that might prove the Ashfords had ever existed in Redwater. I grabbed my laptop, tried to save the footage to multiple drives, uploaded it to 3 different cloud services, even emailed it to myself. But when I went to check the files the next morning, they were all corrupted, just static and digital noise, except for the original on my store's hard drive. I drove to my store at 5 that morning, didn't even shower, just threw on yesterday's clothes and drove with the windows down to keep myself alert. The moment I walked through the back entrance, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but things were wrong in small ways that only I would notice. The stack of paint cans I'd arranged by color was now arranged by size. The key to the storage room was on a different hook, and my office door, which I always left exactly half open, was now wide open. My computer was still on, showing the camera feeds, but when I checked the recordings from the night, there was a gap, 43 minutes missing between 2:15 and 2:58 a.m., right before the vans would have passed by my store on their way to Tom's house. My son Brett came home from school that day talking about these friendly men who'd visited during lunch, said they were from some state education board, checking on student welfare or something. They'd pulled him aside, asked him about his home life, his dad's work, whether I ever talked about town politics at dinner, whether I seemed stressed lately. Brett thought it was weird but figured it was just government bureaucracy. Except these men knew details, mentioned the exact model of security camera I'd installed, asked if I'd been having trouble with the storage devices, suggested that sometimes people who get too curious about their neighbor's business could put their families at risk. Brett laughed it off, said he told them I just sold hammers and nails, nothing exciting. But the way he looked at me when he told the story, I could see he was scared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just sat in the living room with my laptop, watching the camera feeds, the hard drive with Tom's abduction footage hidden inside an old paint can in the garage. Nancy kept asking what was wrong, but how could I tell her that our mayor was disappearing people, that we were probably next? Around 2 a.m, she finally gave up and went to bed, and I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke up to my phone buzzing with a motion alert from the front door camera. The timestamp said 3:03 a.m., and when I opened the app with shaking fingers, the screen showed my front door wide open, swaying gently in the night breeze. But the camera inside the house, the one that should have shown who opened it, that feed was just black. I ran upstairs, checked on Brett first, then Nancy, both still asleep, breathing normal, doors locked from the inside. But when I went back downstairs, there was a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before, pristine white with typed text. Your family seems lovely, especially Brett. Such a bright future ahead of him. The town meeting is next Monday. We trust you won't have any concerns to raise about recent departures. Sometimes the best hardware stores are the quiet ones. No signature, no letterhead, but I didn't need one. I burned that paper in the sink, packed what we could fit in the truck, and we left Redwater that same morning, told Nancy and Brett we were visiting my brother in Colorado, just a spontaneous family trip. We never went back, and when I called a cousin 2 months later to ask about the store, he said it had burned down in an electrical fire, along with all the security equipment inside, and Mayor Brennan had personally overseen the cleanup, making sure nothing dangerous was left behind. Our town still talks about that championship season like it was a miracle, but I know better. I was there for all of it, number 63 on the offensive line. Graduated back in 2015 and watched everything fall apart that summer. We weren't supposed to win a single playoff game that year, let alone take state. The town had maybe 4,000 people, the kind of place where the Dairy Queen closes at 8, and Friday night lights aren't just a saying. They're basically a religion. The boosters ran everything. These older guys who'd played back in the 70s and 80s, still wearing their leather jackets to games like they were still 17. They had money from oil leases and car dealerships, and they treated our team like it was their personal investment portfolio. I didn't understand what that meant until it was way too late. The whole thing started making sense to me during our semi-final game, when I noticed Coach Pruitt pulling Jesse Vaughn aside between every series. Jesse was our starting quarterback, clean-cut kid whose dad happened to be the district attorney. Smart guy too, actually earned his grades unlike some of us who were getting, let's say, a lot of help from certain teachers. I remember watching Jesse's face during those sideline conversations, how he'd nod and look down at his cleats, never making eye contact with Coach. After we won that semifinal 38-7, which should have been impossible against a team that had Division I recruits, I saw Jesse in the locker room sitting alone on the bench. He was still in full pads 20 minutes after everyone else had showered. His hands were gripping his helmet so hard his knuckles were white, and when I asked if he was okay, he just looked at me and said, "We're gonna pay for this." I laughed it off then, thought he was being dramatic about the championship pressure. I wish I'd asked him what he really meant. We won state 2 weeks later in a game that felt wrong from the opening kickoff. The other team's best defensive end got injured in the first quarter, something about his knee just giving out during a routine play. Their cornerback left at halftime with what they called food poisoning. By the fourth quarter, we were up by 40 points and the stadium felt more tense than celebratory. I remember standing on the field during the trophy presentation, confetti falling around us, and noticing how the boosters were all grouped together near the 50-yard line. They weren't cheering or hugging anyone. They were just watching us with these intense expressions, like ranchers counting cattle they'd just bought. One of them, this guy named Vernon who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, caught my eye and gave me this slow nod. It made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't explain. That night at the team party, I overheard two of the boosters talking in the parking lot about final numbers and better than projected. I didn't stick around to hear more. The summer after graduation should have been the best time of our lives. College signing day was coming up in August, and 4 of us had scholarship offers. Jesse had a full ride to a decent Division II school. Then there was Troy Sanderson, our middle linebacker who hit like a freight train, heading to a junior college with promises of bigger things. Curtis Yang, our running back who'd rushed for over 2,000 yards that season, had multiple schools calling him. And Blake Donovan, our tight end, had interest from a Division I program. All 4 of them were going places, getting out of town, making something of themselves. I wasn't one of the lucky ones with offers, so I'd signed up to work at my uncle's machine shop and take classes at the community college. But I was happy for them. Really, I was. Then the accident started happening, and happy became the last thing any of us felt. Troy died first, middle of June on a Wednesday morning. They said his truck rolled on County Road 12, that he must have fallen asleep at the wheel coming back from his girlfriend's place. But Troy never drove tired. He was obsessive about it ever since his cousin died in a wreck when we were sophomores. The sheriff's report said there were no skid marks, no signs he'd tried to brake or swerve. His truck just went off the road at a curve that every person in the county could drive blindfolded. When I went to the viewing, his mom grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. She whispered right in my ear, "They did this to him. He was going to talk." I didn't understand what she meant, but the way she said it, with her voice shaking and her eyes red from crying for days, it planted something cold in my chest. At the funeral, I noticed Vernon and 2 other boosters standing in the back of the church. They didn't come to the burial. They just stood there during the service, arms crossed, watching. Curtis was next, 3 weeks later in early July, drowning accident at the quarry where we'd all been swimming since we were kids. The weird part was Curtis hated deep water, wouldn't even go to the lake without a life jacket. His parents said he'd gone out there alone, which made 0 sense because Curtis never did anything alone. He was the most social guy on the team, always surrounded by people. The police found his truck in the parking area, and his clothes folded neatly on a rock by the water's edge. Who folds their clothes before going swimming at a quarry? The whole thing felt staged, like someone was trying to make it look like he'd decided to take a peaceful swim and just didn't come back up. His phone was in his truck, and when the cops checked it, they said the last texts he'd sent were deleted. The phone company couldn't or wouldn't recover them. At the memorial service, Jesse showed up late and left early. I caught him on the way out and asked if he was all right. He just shook his head and said, "I'm trying to figure out if I should run or stay." Then he got in his car and drove off before I could ask what he meant. Blake Donovan died on a Thursday night in late July, and this one they didn't even try to make look accidental. House fire while he was sleeping started in the garage, according to the fire marshal. They said it was electrical, faulty wiring in a house that had just passed inspection 6 months earlier. Blake's dad was a contractor, kept that house maintained like it was a museum. The fire moved too fast, trapped Blake in his upstairs bedroom before he could get out. The thing that made me sick was Blake had called me 2 days before. He was scared, really scared, said he needed to tell me something important but not over the phone. We were supposed to meet at the batting cages on Friday. He never made it. After the fire, I drove past his house and saw the boosters again. Vernon and this other guy named Chip who ran the biggest construction company in the county. They were standing across the street with the fire chief, all three of them talking quiet and serious. When Vernon saw me slow down, he stared right at me until I drove away. That night I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about Troy's mom saying they did this, about Curtis's deleted texts, about Blake's phone call. 3 scholarship players dead in 6 weeks. The math was too ugly to ignore. Then on a Saturday morning in early August, Blake's little brother knocked on my door at 6 in the morning. The kid was 14, skinny, still in his pajamas. He'd ridden his bike 4 miles to my house. He handed me a USB drive and said Blake had given it to him the week before he died. Told him if anything happened to hide it and only give it to someone he trusted. The kid chose me because I used to help Blake with algebra homework, and his brother said I was a good guy. I asked him what was on it, and he said he didn't know, that Blake made him promise not to look. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes just staring at that little black drive, feeling the weight of what holding it might mean. When I finally plugged it into my laptop, I found video files. Recordings Blake had made on his phone during practices, during meetings, during conversations he'd had with boosters in parking lots after games. There were spreadsheets too, showing payment amounts next to game dates and point spreads. And there were text messages, screenshots of conversations between Coach Pruitt, Vernon, Chip, and 2 other boosters about which players were getting grade changes. About steroid suppliers, about gambling debts, about keeping Jesse in line because his dad could cause problems. I spent the whole day going through everything on that drive, and by evening I understood exactly what had gotten my teammates killed. They'd all figured it out, probably around the same time. The boosters had bet massive amounts on our games, fixed the outcomes through steroids and intimidation, and manipulated our grades to keep us eligible. When we won state, they'd made hundreds of thousands, maybe more. But Troy, Curtis, Blake, and Jesse had decided they were going to report it all. There were voice memos on the drive, Blake recording himself talking about how the 4 of them had agreed to come forward together after signing day once their scholarships were secure. They were going to testify, bring everything down, make sure no other kids got used the way we were, except the boosters found out somehow. I sat there in my kitchen as the sun went down, realizing I was holding evidence that could send powerful people to prison, evidence that 3 people had already died for. My first instinct was to drive straight to the police station. Then I remembered the fire chief talking to Vernon. I remembered the sheriff's report on Troy's accident with no investigation, just conclusions. I realized the boosters owned more than just the team. The next morning, Sunday, I was trying to decide who I could trust when I got a call from the hospital. Jesse had been hit by a car while jogging, a hit and run that left him paralyzed from the waist down. The nurse said he'd been asking for me, kept saying my name over and over. When I got to his room, Jesse was hooked up to machines, his legs completely still under the white sheets. His face was swollen on one side, stitches across his forehead. He grabbed my hand when I sat down, squeezed it hard despite the IV lines taped to his arm. "They got me too," he whispered. Black Ford pickup, no plates, ran me down on purpose. Backed up like they were gonna finish it, then someone's porch light came on and they took off. His voice was shaking. I'm the last one left who was going to talk. Troy, Curtis, Blake, me. We were all going to the state police together. Now they're dead and I'm broken. He started crying then, and I just held his hand, not knowing what to say. After a minute, he looked at me hard and said, "My dad can't know about any of this. He'll try to fix it legally and they'll kill him too. They own the sheriff, probably half the judges. We're trapped." I left the hospital with that USB drive burning a hole in my pocket and a decision to make. I couldn't go to local cops. I couldn't tell Jesse's dad without putting him in danger. But I also couldn't let 3 murders and an attempted murder just disappear because some rich guys wanted to protect their gambling operation. That night, I drove 2 hours north to a different county and walked into a state police barracks I'd found online. I asked for the detective unit and told them I had evidence of multiple homicides connected to organized crime. They put me in a room with 2 investigators, a woman named Detective Barnes and her partner. I handed them the USB drive and told them everything. They listened for 3 hours, took notes, made copies. Detective Barnes looked at me when I finished and said, "You did the right thing coming here. Stay away from those men. Don't tell anyone you talked to us." They said they'd open an investigation quietly, that it would take time to build a case that could stand up against people with money and connections. I drove home that night terrified but also relieved, like I'd just set down a weight that had been crushing me. 2 days later, Jesse called me from the hospital. His voice sounded different, heavier somehow. "They came to see me," he said. "Vernon and Chip. Brought flowers, said how sorry they were about my accident. Vernon squeezed my shoulder and told me how important it is to focus on recovery, not on things that are in the past. Said the past can't help me walk again, but the right attitude and the right support can." Then he mentioned that my dad's up for re-election next year. Said it would be a shame if anything complicated that for him. Jesse went quiet for a second. "They know I was going to talk, they're making sure I don't. And now I'm sitting here thinking about my parents, about you, about anyone else who might get hurt. I'm making a choice to keep them safe." 3 weeks after that conversation, Jesse gave a statement to the local police from his hospital bed. He said he and the other 3 had been planning to come forward about the grade fixing and steroids, that they'd collected evidence but that someone must have found out. He implicated Coach Pruitt, Vernon, Chip, and 2 other boosters by name. The story hit the local newspaper the next day. The state police moved fast after that, raids and arrests within a week. But when they went to collect the evidence from the sheriff's office where Jesse had told them he'd handed over a copy, it was gone. Missing from the evidence locker, no sign of forced entry, no explanation. The case fell apart without physical proof. But here's what they didn't know. I still had Blake's original USB drive, the one his brother gave me, the one I'd made copies from before going to the state police. I'd hidden it in a safe deposit box in a bank 3 towns over, under my grandmother's name. When the evidence disappeared and the arrests got dropped, Detective Barnes called me personally. She was frustrated, angry, said she knew what had happened but couldn't prove it. I told her about the backup. Within 2 days, federal investigators got involved, people from outside our region who didn't have connections to our county. The USB drive went into federal custody, and this time there were chains of evidence, documentation, witnesses to every transfer. It took 8 months, but eventually they built a case that stuck. Vernon, Chip, Coach Pruitt, and 4 others, including the sheriff, got indicted on racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and about a dozen other charges. Jesse's dad had to recuse himself because of the conflict, but he made sure the case went to prosecutors who wouldn't fold. The trials happened over the course of a year. Vernon got 25 years. Chip got 20. Coach Pruitt turned witness and got 8. The sheriff got 15. Jesse never walked again, but he testified from his wheelchair at every single trial. He'd rebuilt his life by then, started taking online classes, got engaged to a girl he met in physical therapy. We talk once a month or so. He tells me he doesn't regret speaking up, even though it cost him his legs and nearly cost him his life. Troy, Curtis, and Blake didn't get that choice, he says, so he had to make it count for all of them. I still live in that town, believe it or not. It's different now, quieter. The football program got shut down for 3 years, and when it came back, it was under complete oversight with new coaching staff and strict academic standards. People don't talk about that championship season anymore. Most folks act like it never happened, like if they ignore it long enough, the shame will fade. I see Blake's little brother sometimes, the kid who rode his bike to my house that morning. He's in college now, studying criminal justice. He told me last time I saw him that he wants to be the kind of person who protects people the way his brother tried to. I think about that drive he gave me, about the courage it took for Blake to document everything knowing what it might cost him. Some nights I still can't sleep, thinking about how close we came to letting them get away with all of it. But then I remember Jesse in that courtroom, sitting up straight in his wheelchair, pointing at Vernon and saying, "That man killed my friends." And I know we did the only thing we could do. We made sure people knew the truth, no matter what it cost us. Journalism was supposed to be about truth, about holding power accountable. That's what they told us in college anyway. When I graduated from Northwestern in 2014, I had these grand ideas about investigative reporting, about making a difference. Instead, I spent 5 years covering city council meetings in suburbs outside Chicago, writing about zoning disputes and school board drama. When the position opened at the Harrisville Gazette in January 2023, I jumped at it. Small-town Nebraska, population 3,200. But it was a real reporting job. I'd be covering county government, agriculture, local business, real stories, the kind that mattered to people's lives. I packed everything I owned into my Subaru and drove west, watching the landscape flatten into endless fields. Harrisville sat in Douglas County, right in the heart of farm country, where the economy lived and died by rainfall and crop prices. The Gazette office was a converted storefront on 2nd Avenue, just me, the editor Phil Kendrick, and a part-time photographer named Joyce who also did layout. Phil was maybe 60, with reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead and coffee stains on every shirt he owned. He seemed relieved to have help, even if I was just some kid from the city who didn't know soybeans from corn. The desk I inherited belonged to someone named Catherine Moss. Phil mentioned it casually my first day, showing me where she kept her source files, her contact lists, her half-finished articles saved in folders organized by topic. "Katie was with us for 11 years, he said, pulling open drawers, showing me her system. "Good reporter, real good. She died in a car accident last November, about 2 months back. Single vehicle collision on Route 14, heading home from a county meeting. Rolled her car 3 times. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe weather. I noticed he didn't quite meet my eyes when he talked about it. The desk still had her things in it. Reporters' notebooks filled with shorthand I couldn't decipher, business cards rubber-banded together, a coffee mug that said, "Journalists do it," in quotes. I felt strange sitting there, using her computer login that Phil had reset for me, like I was inhabiting someone's ghost. The town itself seemed pleasant enough at first. Downtown had that scrubbed, desperate charm of rural places trying not to die. A diner called Rosie's Place, where everyone knew everyone. A farm supply store, a dollar store, 2 churches, a bar called the Grain Elevator that I'd later learn was where the real business of the county happened. People were friendly in that Midwestern way, but there was something underneath it, something tight around the eyes. I figured it was just economic anxiety. The drought had been brutal for 3 straight years. Farms were struggling. That much was obvious from the foreclosure notices I had to typeset for the legal ads section. My first month was uneventful. I covered a county commissioner meeting where they discussed road maintenance budgets. I wrote about the high school basketball team making regionals. I interviewed the owner of the feed store about rising costs. Standard small-town reporting, the kind where you learn who matters by who talks to whom after meetings. The commissioners were typical local politicians, a retired farmer named Eugene Pratt, a woman named Dorothy Chen who ran the hardware store, and the chair, a guy named Warren Gilmore. Gilmore was the one everyone deferred to. Mid-50s, tall. With silver hair he kept perfectly trimmed and expensive boots that didn't match the rest of his outfit. He'd been a county commissioner for almost 15 years, and before that he'd worked in agricultural lending at the bank. People spoke about him with a mix of respect and something else, something I couldn't quite name. During my second meeting, I watched him shut down a farmer who wanted to discuss water allocation with just a smile and a procedural motion. The farmer, this weathered guy with dirt under his fingernails and desperation in his voice, just deflated and left without another word. I started going through Katie's files in early April, mostly out of boredom. Phil had given me a feature assignment about the drought's economic impact, and I figured she might have notes I could use. Her organizational system was meticulous, color-coded folders, cross-referenced sources, timelines written on legal pads. But one folder, shoved in the back of the bottom drawer, wasn't labeled. Inside were printouts of property records, foreclosure notices going back 5 years, handwritten notes with names and dates connected by arrows. At the top of one page, underlined 3 times, Prairie Holdings LLC. Then below it, Silverstone Agricultural Partners. Below that, Meridian Farmstead Group. All shell companies, from what I could tell. And next to each one, in Katie's handwriting, same registered agent. Same address. Why? I pulled out my laptop and started searching. The registered address for all 3 companies was a mailbox place in Lincoln, one of those UPS store locations. The registered agent was a lawyer named Herbert Quinn who specialized in business formation. Nothing illegal about that, technically. Lots of investors use LLCs to buy property. But something about the pattern bothered me. I cross-referenced the properties these companies had purchased with the county GIS maps. 14 farms, all acquired in the last 4 years. All in foreclosure. All in the western part of the county, near where the aquifer ran deepest. The next page in Katie's folder made my stomach turn. She'd written a list of names with dates next to them. Robert Finch, August 2022, suicide. Paul Weaver, January 2023, suicide. Dennis York, October 2022, suicide. 4 names total. All farmers. All had lost their properties to foreclosure. All had taken their own lives within months of losing their land. I knew farm suicides were a real problem, especially during economic downturns. The stress, the debt, the generational shame of losing family land. But 4 in 18 months, all in the same county, all following the same pattern. Katie had circled one name, Robert Finch. Next to it, she'd written, "Wife says water pressure dropped 6 months before foreclosure. Wells on neighboring properties fine." Coincidence? I sat there staring at that note for a long time. Water pressure. In the middle of a drought, in an agricultural area where water meant survival, someone's well pressure mysteriously drops. Then they can't irrigate, crops fail, they default on loans, lose everything, and end up putting a shotgun in their mouth. And somehow these shell companies swoop in and buy the land at auction for cents on the dollar. I knew I should probably take this to Phil, but I wanted to understand it better first. I spent the rest of that week digging through public records, county water rights permits, agricultural loan documents from the bank, property transfers, court records from the foreclosure proceedings. What I found was a masterclass in legal theft. Each time a farm went into financial trouble, Prairie Holdings or one of the other LLCs would suddenly appear as a creditor, holding liens I couldn't trace back to any original loan. These mystery debts would pile up, forcing foreclosures even when the farmers were current on their bank loans. And every single time, Warren Gilmore's name appeared somewhere in the documents, as a witness, as a notary, as the commissioner who approved water permit transfers. Never directly as an owner or buyer, always just adjacent to the transactions. Katie had figured this out. I was sure of it. Her last entry was dated November 8, 2023, 5 days before she died. It just said, "Gilmore. It's all Gilmore. Meeting with source tomorrow, should have proof." But there was no note about who the source was, no indication of what proof she expected to get. And then she was dead on Route 14. Her car wrapped around a utility pole on a clear night, on a straight road she'd driven 1,000 times. The highway patrol report called it driver error, possible fatigue. But Katie's notes told a different story, one that ended abruptly and violently. I should have walked away right then. Should have stuffed those files back in the drawer and focused on basketball games and county fairs. Instead, I did what journalists do when they're young and stupid and think truth matters more than self-preservation. I kept digging. I started interviewing the families of the farmers who died. Most wouldn't talk to me. They'd just shake their heads and close the door, or tell me they had nothing to say. But Robert Finch's widow, a woman named Helen who looked 20 years older than she probably was, invited me into her rental house on the edge of town. She'd lost the farm, lost her husband, and ended up in a cramped two-bedroom that smelled like cigarettes and resignation. Nobody cared when I told them about the water, she said, sitting at her kitchen table with shaking hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Robert noticed it first in April of 2022. Water pressure from the well just dropped, like someone had crimped the line. He had the well inspected, had the pump checked, everything tested fine mechanically. But the water barely trickled out, couldn't irrigate properly. Crops suffered. By harvest, we knew we were done. I asked her if any neighbors had similar problems. She laughed, bitter and sharp. That's the thing. Miller's to our east, their well was fine. Johnson's to the west, perfect water pressure. Just us right in the middle, like someone had turned off a valve somewhere underground. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. Warren Gilmore came by about a month after the pressure dropped. Said he'd heard we were having trouble, offered to help us restructure our loans. Real friendly about it. Robert didn't trust him, told him no. 2 weeks later, we got notice that some company we'd never heard of had a lien on our property for agricultural services we never received. By the time we figured out how to fight it, there were 3 more liens, all from different companies, all with the same lawyer representing them. The pattern was suffocating in its precision. After Helen, I managed to track down Dennis York's brother, who told me almost the same story. Water problems, Gilmore offering help, mystery liens appearing like clockwork. I started working on a draft article, trying to connect the dots in a way that was airtight enough to publish. But the problem with small-town corruption is that it's designed to look legitimate on paper. Every document was technically legal. Every foreclosure followed proper procedure. I needed something concrete, something that proved coordination, that showed Gilmore was behind the shell companies. I needed what Katie had been looking for when she died. That's when the first USB drive showed up. It was mid-May, a Tuesday morning. I got to the office around 8, and there was a manila envelope on my desk with no return address, no postage, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a thumb drive, the cheap kind you can buy in bulk anywhere. No note, no explanation. I plugged it into my computer, half expecting it to be empty or full of viruses. Instead, I found a folder labeled Prairie Holdings Financial Records, 2018-2023. Bank statements, wire transfers, articles of incorporation with signatures. And there, listed as the sole member of Prairie Holdings LLC, was a name I recognized. Warren Gilmore's brother-in-law, a guy named Jeffrey Ruiz who lived in Omaha and worked in commercial real estate. The money trail was all there. Loans issued to farmers at predatory rates through Ruiz's company, then sold to Prairie Holdings at a discount when the farmers defaulted. Water rights quietly transferred through county permits that Gilmore himself had approved. Profits funneled back through a network of accounts that eventually led to a joint investment fund owned by Gilmore and Ruiz together. I spent the entire day verifying what I could. The corporate records checked out. The signatures matched. This was it. This was what Katie had died trying to expose. I called Phil into my office and showed him everything. He sat there reading through the files for almost an hour, his face getting grayer with each page. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "You know what this means?" he said quietly. "If we publish this, we're accusing a sitting county commissioner of fraud, conspiracy, and possibly murder." I told him I knew. He asked if I was sure, if I'd verified everything, if I was prepared for the legal fight that would follow. I said yes to all of it, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. Phil nodded slowly, then told me to write it up. We'd run it in Sunday's edition, give it the front page, the whole treatment. I went home that night feeling like I'd finally done something that mattered, like Katie's death wouldn't be for nothing. I lived about 4 miles outside town, renting a small farmhouse on property owned by an elderly couple who'd moved to a retirement community in Lincoln. It was quiet out there, just me and cornfields and the occasional coyote. When I pulled into the driveway around 9 that night, My headlights swept across the front porch. There was something on the steps. I parked and got out slowly, confused at first about what I was seeing. Then the smell hit me, metallic and thick and wrong. It was a calf, maybe 3 months old, lying on its side on my porch steps with its throat cut so deep the head was nearly severed. Blood had pooled on the wood, dripping down to the dirt below. The animal's eyes were still open, glazed and empty. There was no note, no message, just the dead animal and the clear implication of what would happen if I continued. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, trying to process what I was looking at. This wasn't random. This wasn't teenagers playing a prank. This was professional. This was a warning delivered by someone who knew how to butcher livestock, who had access to animals, who knew where I lived and what I was working on. I called the sheriff's department. Deputy showed up 40 minutes later, a young guy named Scott Patterson who looked more annoyed than concerned. He took photos, asked me if I had any enemies, if there were any disputes with neighbors. I didn't mention the article. Didn't mention Gilmore or the investigation. Just said I had no idea who would do this. He told me it was probably kids, maybe someone who didn't like outsiders, that I should get a security camera. Then he left, and I was alone with a dead calf on my porch and the growing realization that someone very dangerous knew exactly what I was doing. I cleaned up the blood myself that night, hosing down the steps until the water ran clear, then dragging the calf's body to the tree line and covering it with a tarp. I didn't sleep, just sat in my living room with every light on, watching the windows, wondering who was watching me back. The next morning I told Phil what happened. He went pale, actually pale, like the blood had drained straight out of his face. We sat in his office with the door closed while he chain-smoked cigarettes, which he wasn't supposed to do inside, but nobody was going to stop him right then. Katie got a dead dog in her yard, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. About a week before she died, German Shepherd throat cut left on her front lawn. She told me about it, said she was going to drop the investigation. Then 5 days later, she's dead on Route 14. The cigarette shook in his hand. I should have told you. Should have warned you when you started going through her files. But I thought maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe she really did just fall asleep at the wheel. He looked at me with something like guilt mixed with fear. We can't run the story. I'm sorry, but we can't. They'll kill you. They killed Katie and they'll kill you too. I understood where he was coming from. I really did. But I also knew that if I stopped now, if I let fear win, then Katie died for nothing and Gilmore would keep destroying families until someone finally stopped him. I told Phil I needed to think about it. I drove home, watching my rearview mirror the entire way, checking for cars that might be following me. The second USB drive was waiting in my mailbox when I arrived. Same manila envelope, same block letters, different thumb drive. This one had emails. Hundreds of them, going back years between Gilmore and various people. Discussions about water tables and geological surveys. Instructions to a man named Leo Vance, who apparently worked for the county maintenance department, about which wells to service and when. Leo would go out under the guise of routine inspections and somehow sabotage the wells so subtly that it looked like natural decline. Pressure drops, mineral buildup, pump malfunctions that seemed legitimate but were carefully engineered. The emails were damning. They proved intent, proved coordination, proved everything. But they also meant someone inside Gilmore's operation was feeding me information. Someone who wanted him exposed badly enough to risk their own life. That night, another animal appeared. This time it was a dog, some kind of mixed breed. Throat cut identically to the calf left at the end of my driveway where I'd have to see it when I left for work. I didn't call the sheriff, didn't bother with photos or reports. Just buried it in the back corner of the property and tried to figure out what to do. The animals kept coming. A cat 2 days later, a goat the day after that. Always throat cut, always positioned where I couldn't miss them. Always at night when no one would see who was doing it. I stopped sleeping entirely, started jumping at every sound, every car that drove past, every shadow that moved. I realized this was the point. They weren't going to kill me outright like they probably did to Katie. They were going to terrorize me until I either left town or destroyed the evidence myself. Psychological torture, designed to break me without leaving any connection back to Gilmore. On the 7th night, I sat in my dark living room with my laptop, looking at all the evidence, all the files, all the proof. I thought about Katie driving home on that clear night, probably watching her rearview mirror just like I'd been doing, probably knowing she was in danger but believing the truth mattered more. I thought about the farmers who'd lost everything, about Robert Finch putting a shotgun in his mouth because he couldn't understand why his water had failed, about Helen Finch chain-smoking in her rental house with nothing left but memories and bitterness. Then I did something that probably saved my life but still makes me feel like a coward. I copied everything onto 3 separate drives. I packaged one and mailed it to the Omaha World-Herald with a cover letter explaining the entire situation. I sent another to the Nebraska Attorney General's office with copies of all the financial documents and emails. The third I sent to the FBI field office in Lincoln, because wire fraud and conspiracy cross state lines, and that makes it federal. Then I wrote a short article for the Gazette, not the full investigative piece I'd planned, just a basic news story saying that documents had been provided to state and federal authorities regarding potential corruption in Douglas County land acquisitions, and that investigations were pending. I included no names, no details, nothing that would be legally actionable, just enough to put it on record that the information existed and had been distributed. Phil ran it on page 3 of that Sunday's edition, buried between a church fundraiser announcement and an obituary. The animals stopped appearing after that, just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. I think they realized the intimidation had failed, that killing me at that point would only draw attention to what I'd sent out. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. I went to work, wrote boring articles about city council meetings, tried to pretend my hands didn't shake every time I heard a car door close outside. Then the FBI showed up in Harrisville. 4 agents in suits, meeting with county officials, requesting documents, interviewing people. Warren Gilmore hired a lawyer from Lincoln, one of those expensive ones who specialize in white-collar defense. The investigation took 8 months. They arrested Gilmore in January 2024, along with Jeffrey Ruiz and Leo Vance, the county maintenance guy who'd been sabotaging the wells. Federal charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, racketeering. The state piled on charges related to abuse of public office and falsifying official documents. The trial was in Omaha, lasted 5 weeks, and ended with guilty verdicts on nearly every count. Gilmore got 18 years in federal prison. Ruiz got 12. Vance took a plea deal and got 6 years in exchange for testifying against the others. The farms they'd stolen got tied up in asset forfeiture proceedings, eventually returned to the families, or sold at auction with proceeds going to the victims. It didn't bring back the dead farmers, didn't undo the suicides or the destroyed families, but it was something. I never found out who sent me those USB drives. My best guess is it was someone in Gilmore's inner circle who'd had enough. Maybe someone who'd watched the scheme destroy their community and finally grew a conscience. Or maybe it was someone who wanted a piece of the operation for themselves and saw an opportunity to eliminate competition. I'll never know. I left Harrisville 6 months after the arrests. Took a job at a paper in Des Moines covering state politics, something safer. Something where the stakes didn't involve dead animals on my porch and cars running off straight roads in the middle of the night. Phil retired last year, sold the Gazette to a media conglomerate that turned it into a mostly online operation. We still email occasionally. He never apologized for being willing to kill the story, and I never blamed him for it. Fear is a reasonable response to real danger, and what we faced was absolutely real. The assignment came at a moment when I felt like I needed distance from people, so the idea of spending half a year in the big thicket sounded almost comforting. I'd built a small reputation photographing rare bird species, nothing glamorous, just enough that magazines trusted me to work alone. That first week in the cabin felt peaceful in a strange, heavy way, like the woods were studying me while I was studying them. The place sat on a narrow clearing surrounded by pine and undergrowth so dense it looked like walls. The elderly couple who rented it to me, Harold and June, lived a mile deeper in the trees, their place resting on an uneven patch of ground with a leaning porch and a wind chime made of mismatched silverware. They told me their son handled all the paperwork but lived in town, though they never clarified where. I didn't think much of it at the time. My days were spent hiking to wetlands and shadowed creeks, trying to catch glimpses of warblers and kites, coming back exhausted but satisfied. The first odd thing I noticed was my tripod. I left it folded by the door every night, and one morning it was propped against the wall near the kitchenette like someone had set it there carefully. I tried brushing it off, telling myself I must have moved it without paying attention, maybe while half asleep. But then a memory card I'd filled 2 days earlier came up blank. All the files were gone. No corruption, no formatting error, just wiped clean. I started keeping the cards in a small tin under my mattress, thinking maybe humidity had messed with them, though deep down I didn't believe that. Every morning I stepped onto the porch and saw footprints in the damp soil, not boots, bare feet, wide and oddly flat, like someone walked with their toes gripping the earth. They circled the cabin in a loose drifting path, looping close to my windows before disappearing toward the thicker brush behind the property. To get a better idea of what was happening while I slept, I set up a few motion-activated trail cameras at different angles around the cabin. The first night they didn't capture anything unusual, just a raccoon nosing around my fire pit. But on the second night, one camera caught a man standing between two pines barely visible, almost blending into the shadows. He wasn't facing the cabin exactly, but turning his head slightly like he was listening for something. His posture was stiff, arms hanging in a strange, heavy way. I didn't recognize him from anywhere, and when I zoomed in, the details made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. The face looked slack, but the eyes seemed fixed on something behind the camera. When I showed the image to Harold and June the next morning, they exchanged a look so quick I almost missed it. June kept smoothing the front of her apron, while Harold insisted wildlife cameras often distort shapes and trick the eyes, though I hadn't mentioned the figure's shape or posture. The following nights, the cameras captured the same man again and again. Each time he appeared a little closer to the cabin, standing in different positions, behind the woodpile, near the back corner, beside the rain barrel. He always stood still, facing slightly away, as if pretending not to look at the cabin while clearly inching toward it. The fourth image nearly made me drop my tablet. He was right at the tree line, maybe 20 feet from my porch rail, his clothes wrinkled and smeared with dirt. That was also the first time I recognized him. There was a framed photo in Harold and June's living room of a younger man holding a fishing rod, smiling wide with his eyes squinting against the sun. The man in my photos had that same face, only drained of warmth and years older. Their son. The one they claimed lived in town. The one they mentioned only in short, dismissive comments like they were trying to keep him sealed behind glass. When I walked to their place the next morning, the air felt strangely still, as if the woods were waiting to hear what I would say. Their home always carried a faint smell of cedar and something medicinal, and I remember how June's hands kept fidgeting with the edge of a dish towel while Harold guided me to the small kitchen table. I told them I recognized the man from their photo, that he'd been around my cabin for days. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush my breath. June finally spoke, her voice thin and brittle, saying their son Daniel had died 10 years earlier in a hunting accident somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. She shared it like a rehearsed story, one she'd said many times yet hated repeating. Harold nodded along, staring at the wood grain of the table instead of looking at me. The problem was, the Daniel in my trail cam photos didn't look like someone gone a decade. He looked very much alive and very much present. I asked if anyone else could have been in the woods, maybe a relative who resembled him, maybe a neighbor passing through. They both shook their heads insistently. Harold said people didn't wander around this part of the forest without a reason, especially at night. Their certainty made my arms tense, like my body was bracing for something it couldn't yet name. When I asked if I could see a picture of Daniel a little closer, June hesitated, then rose to retrieve the same frame I'd noticed earlier. The moment she set it in front of me, I felt a jolt. Not fear exactly, but the unsettling recognition that the differences between the photo and the man on my camera weren't random aging. His hair in the photo was neatly trimmed. The man outside my cabin had longer, uneven strands that stuck to his temples as though he'd been sweating or running. The shape of his jaw looked a bit sharper now, like he'd lost weight recently. None of it lined up with a decade-old death. I thanked them and left, though their eyes stayed on my back the entire walk down the dirt path. The unease followed me into the afternoon, clinging to each quiet hour. While shooting along a shallow creek bed, I kept replaying everything in my head. The footprints, the wiped memory cards, the tripod moved with such intention it almost felt polite. When I returned to the cabin for lunch, I walked straight into the bathroom to wash my hands and caught something that made my breath hitch. On the counter by the mirror sat a small orange prescription bottle. I hadn't seen it that morning. The label listed a recent fill date and a patient name, Daniel Parson. Not his mother's medication, not a decade-old remnant, current. I slowly lifted the bottle and turned it in my hand, noticing the address matched Harold and June's. It felt like the room shifted around me as I set it back exactly where it had been. A question kept circling my mind. Why would they tell me he was dead if he was clearly still under their roof? That question dug even deeper when I found the rental agreement that night. I kept all my paperwork tucked in a folder under my field laptop. The signature line was filled with neat cursive, June Parson. But the pen pressure was uneven, almost like someone wasn't used to writing in that style. I compared it to the note June had left me on move-in day, a reminder about the spare keys. The handwriting didn't match at all. The rental agreement had a firmer slant, the strokes more deliberate. I held the flashlight near the paper until the edges glowed, and that's when I noticed the tiniest indentation at the bottom, an accidental trace of another name, written lightly beneath the main signature. Daniel. It looked like someone had started writing their own name, then overwritten it with his mother's. My hands started trembling despite how tight I held them against my sides. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched the tree line through the windows, waiting to see if he would appear again. By the next morning, leaving felt like the only reasonable choice. I packed my gear fast, stuffing lenses into padded bags without their usual careful order, and threw clothes into the backseat of my truck. The air felt thick with silence, the kind that presses against the eardrums until every little sound feels amplified. As I stepped outside, I noticed the trail cameras had been turned toward the ground, all of them. Someone had walked right up to each one during the night. No raccoon or hog could have tilted them so precisely. My pulse hammered as I approached the hood of my truck, rehearsing in my head how I would tell Harold and June that I needed to leave early due to work changes. I never got to finish that thought. A few feet from the front tire, something metallic glinted. When I crouched down, I saw the severed ends of my brake lines dark with residue. The cut was clean, deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, my mind scrambling for any explanation that didn't involve another human being preparing for me not to make it out. With the road outrunning directly past their house, walking seemed like the worst idea possible, but staying felt just as dangerous. I kept pacing along the side of the cabin, weighing every option until my head throbbed. The woods weren't quiet anymore. I heard branches shifting slow and cautious, as if something or someone was keeping pace with my movements. My heart lurched every time a pine needle snapped underfoot somewhere beyond the cabin. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen only showed a single flicker of service that vanished as soon as I tried calling for help. In that moment, I realized I wasn't going to get out of this with a simple conversation or a polite goodbye. I grabbed my largest telephoto lens, not as a weapon, but because it was the heaviest thing I owned, and headed toward the narrow path that curved around their property, instead of passing by the front of their house. The detour added nearly a mile of thick underbrush, but it kept me out of view. I moved quickly, brushing branches aside and trying to keep my steps light, even though my heartbeat felt loud enough to echo. At one point I heard something moving parallel to me, matching my pace. Slow, steady, careful. I didn't dare look in its direction. Every instinct in me screamed to keep going. When I finally reached the edge of the couple's backyard, their house stood only 50 yards away, quiet but somehow expectant. Through the window, I saw movement. Harold stepping into the kitchen, raising his hand to shade his eyes as he looked toward the tree line. I ducked behind a fallen log and watched him scan the woods like he was counting seconds, not searching for someone. June joined him a moment later, her face pale, her mouth moving rapidly as if pleading. I couldn't hear the words, but whatever she said made him glance toward the back door in a way that made my chest tighten. When the two of them stepped outside and walked toward the road, it gave me my only opening. While they moved around front, I slipped along the side of their shed and sprinted across the clearing behind their house. My legs burned, but the fear pushed me harder than any adrenaline rush I'd ever felt in the field. Once I reached the old service road that branched away from theirs, I didn't stop. I kept running until the ground leveled and the trees thinned. It took almost 40 minutes before I heard an engine in the distance. I waved down the first truck I saw, a dusty blue pickup driven by a man hauling feed sacks. He didn't ask many questions, just eyed me with concern and unlocked the passenger door. I didn't look back toward the woods until we were several miles out, and even then all I saw were trees swallowing the road behind us. I never returned for my gear or the cabin key. The magazine sent someone else to retrieve what I left behind. They told me later the cabin door was wide open when they arrived, but nothing inside had been touched. Living in a quiet retirement complex just outside Corpus Christi wasn't part of any plan I ever had, but life nudged me there after my aunt passed away and left me her small condo. Most of the residents were decades older than me, which oddly made the place feel calmer than any neighborhood I'd lived in before. I worked remotely back then, so my days were mostly spent watching the slow routines around me. The morning shuffle of walkers on the sidewalk, the shared pot of overly sweet coffee brewing in the community kitchen, and the soft hum of the old ceiling fans that never seemed to turn off. Everyone knew everyone, or at least pretended to, and it didn't take long for me to recognize the familiar faces who moved through each hallway like they'd memorized every inch of it over the years. It was the kind of environment where gossip spread faster than weather changes, usually harmless, usually boring, until the night deaths started stacking up. At first, nobody questioned the pattern. Older residents passed away from time to time, and people tried to make peace with that. But the timing was strange. Every single incident happened deep into the night, always during the same overnight shift, and always with the same home health aide present, Harriet Rowe, a woman most people described as gentle and endlessly patient. She had this way of speaking in a slow, soft rhythm that made even the most anxious residents relax. I didn't know her well, but I'd see her pushing her little cart down the hall, humming these old melodies I couldn't recognize. People loved her. They said she made their parents feel safe, and that she was always there in those final moments, holding a hand or whispering comfort while waiting for the paramedics to arrive. The strange part began when families started whispering in corners. One neighbor, a son visiting his mother, knocked on my door one afternoon looking more exhausted than grieving. He told me his mother's necklace, one she wore obsessively, was suddenly gone after she passed. At first he assumed she'd misplaced it, but when he asked staff, they shrugged and said they hadn't seen it. Then another family mentioned a missing ring, then a missing watch, and when a third family discovered paperwork showing a quietly updated life insurance policy naming Harriet as a beneficiary, the tone of the entire complex changed. People didn't openly accuse her, but you could feel the tension whenever she walked into a room, like conversations paused mid-sentence as everyone recalculated their trust. The turning point for me came the night emergency vehicles arrived for the 4th time in 3 weeks. I watched through my window as Harriet stood outside with the responding paramedics, her arms around herself in this trembling posture that felt rehearsed, like she knew exactly where to stand for people to see her grieving silhouette. Later, when I walked down to the common area, I overheard 2 nurses arguing in a whisper, one insisting that the victim had shown no warning signs earlier that day. Another resident mentioned hearing Harriet talking to the man just before he collapsed, her voice carrying through the thin walls in a strangely low and steady tone. By morning, families were demanding answers from the administration, and although nobody said the words out loud, we all felt the same quiet fear tightening inside us. Whatever was happening wasn't natural, and someone among us knew more than they were admitting. Things escalated when a retired pharmacist named Leon Jacobs visited his cousin who lived 2 doors from me. He was the kind of guy who noticed details most people would gloss over, the type who still carried a small notebook even though his hands shook too much to write in straight lines. After his cousin died unexpectedly during Harriet's shift, Leon asked for the medical sheet and raised his voice in the hallway, pointing out numbers that didn't make sense. He kept saying the readings didn't match what someone with stable vitals should look like before a collapse. Staff tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop talking about chemical imbalances and how easy it was to hide certain substances in bloodstream reports unless someone looked for them specifically. People brushed him off as a grieving relative clinging to theories, until he brought up potassium chloride. A week later, a family demanded an independent review on their father's cause of death, insisting that nothing about his decline matched his behavior earlier that day. The administration reluctantly agreed to release the body, mostly to avoid confrontation, but the funeral home flagged abnormalities that prompted a deeper look. I remember hearing the news from a neighbor who practically ran to my door, breathless and pale. The medical examiner had noticed signs consistent with an induced cardiac arrest. It wasn't definitive proof of foul play yet, but it was enough to request exhumation orders for other recent deaths. The community turned eerily quiet during those days, as if the silence itself had weight. Even the birds seemed to avoid the courtyard. The results hit the complex like a thunderclap. 7 bodies, spanning nearly a year and a half, all showed elevated levels of potassium chloride, levels too high to be accidental, the kind of numbers that could stop a heart within minutes and leave almost no trace unless someone knew exactly where to look. When the announcement became public, people reacted in different ways. Some cried, some got angry, some simply walked in circles like they were trying to orient themselves in a room that suddenly had no doors. I sat on my couch staring at the statement on my phone, my chest tightening with this strange mix of fear and disbelief. It wasn't just the deaths, it was the idea that someone had been choosing who would live and who wouldn't, right under our noses. The police questioned everyone who had been working overnight shifts, but all roads pointed back to Harriet. Her access, her proximity, the fact that she always seemed to be there at the exact moment each resident took their final breath. But what unsettled me the most wasn't the mounting evidence. It was remembering the night I'd taken out the trash around 2 in the morning and saw her leaving one of the units. She wasn't humming that night. She walked slowly, almost drifting, with her hands tucked into her pockets and her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if replaying something in her mind. She didn't acknowledge me, didn't even blink in my direction. I stood there gripping the trash bag, suddenly aware that the hallway around us felt colder than usual, like the temperature had dipped just in that narrow stretch of carpet where she passed. The morning Harriet was arrested, the entire complex gathered behind windows and door frames like a silent audience. She walked out with her hands cuffed in front of her, her expression strangely calm, almost detached from the chaos around her. Reporters appeared within hours, their vans clogging the entrance, while residents clung to each other in the lobby, trying to wrap their minds around how someone so trusted had moved through their parents' final hours with a syringe hidden behind that soothing demeanor. Families showed up carrying folders, photographs, and every scrap of memory they had, searching for clues they wished they'd noticed earlier. I remember feeling this heavy ache in my chest, not sympathy for her, but for the people who believed she'd been an angel in the room, when in reality, she might have been the reason that room fell silent. The investigators later revealed that Harriet kept a small metal box in her locker, containing jewelry pieces from multiple residents. Every item was neatly arranged, each on a piece of felt cloth, almost like a personal collection. They also uncovered a pattern in the amended insurance forms, subtle changes spread out over months, always done quietly, always signed during late-night conversations when residents were tired and far more vulnerable. Some families blamed themselves for trusting her warmth. Others got lawyers involved immediately, and a few simply stopped visiting the complex altogether, unable to bear stepping into a place that now felt tainted by something predatory. As for me, I couldn't shake the image of her gliding through the hallway that night, her footsteps barely touching the carpet. Over the next few months, the atmosphere in the complex shifted into something brittle. Every sound made people jump. Every cough, every slow knock on a door, every late-night creak from the ventilation system. I found myself adopting routines I never had before, double-checking my locks, avoiding the hall at night, keeping my phone fully charged on the nightstand. The residents who remained alive grew suspicious of anyone wearing scrubs, even new employees who had nothing to do with what happened. A therapist volunteered to meet with grieving families and tenants, but very few attended. It felt like no one wanted to talk in rooms where so much had been hidden in plain sight. Eventually, I made the decision to move out. There wasn't a dramatic moment that pushed me to it, just a steady, suffocating sense that the walls carried memories I didn't want to keep living beside. On my last day there, I took one final walk through the courtyard. The benches were empty. The wind barely moved the hedges, and the place felt drained of the warmth it once had. As I locked the door to my aunt's condo for the final time, I thought about the residents Harriet had comforted as they slipped away, and I wondered if any of them realized what was truly happening in those final minutes. I still don't know whether she acted out of malice, delusion, or something darker altogether. But I've never forgotten how close I lived to someone who treated other people's endings as opportunities hidden behind a gentle voice.